Good morning. My name is Ming Long and I have the privilege to serve on the board of CEDA. I live and am working on the land of the Darug people, and I want to pay my respects to our First Peoples. And while haven't our Indigenous leaders who have done a great job protecting their community from COVID. I also wanted to thank Indigenous Australians who, through their welcome to country, continue to welcome a migrant like me and reminds me that I belong. This morning, we have an opportunity to discuss what we would expect of an advanced democracy, and that is how we support vulnerable and at-risk communities. You can follow this discussion on Twitter at CEDA_news and join the conversation using the hashtag SON2020. Please tweet and tweet often. And don't let me ask all of the questions. Could I also encourage you to ask questions using Pigeonhole? The details are on live stream webpage, ceda.pigeonhole.at, and the password is SON2. There is also a poll question in Pigeonhole, which I would love for you to tell us your thoughts. So this morning we have three panelists. We have Dr. Cassandra Goldie, CEO of Australian Council of Social Service, Karim Al-Ansari, Australia's 2019 Youth Representative to the UN, Rajiv Viswanathan, CEO of Indigenous Business Australia. One of the key themes we heard at the start of this pandemic is how equalising it was. This virus did not discriminate. It knows no borders, skin colour or the amount in our bank accounts. But soon after we implemented measures to combat the spread of COVID, we all realised the impact on vulnerable communities was disproportional, and the resilience of our country, and to be selfish, everyone in this conference also depended on how well we looked after our at-risk communities. But it wasn't just COVID, it was the bushfires and more recently the Black Lives Matter movement, which has highlighted the systemic racism that exists in society, which entrenches and magnifies disadvantage. And we know that climate change will also have a devastating impact on these communities. At CEDA, we recognise in our 60th year, our country is at an important crossroad. And I do feel that all of these crises have presented an opportunity for our policymakers to take us in a different direction. Cassandra, let me start with you. We have more than 1.5 million Australians relying on JobSeeker and over 3 million relying on JobKeeper, with some concern around this ending. And yesterday it did feel like the PM was indicating that New Start or JobSeeker would revert to old levels. What are the growth opportunities that exist in lifting or maintaining JobSeeker at current levels?
Yeah, look, Ming, thank you. And can I also acknowledge and thank First Nations peoples, acknowledge elders, past and present, and any of those participating in the event today, and to thank Melinda for the warm invitation from CEDA to be a part of this really important discussion, and my colleagues on this panel. I'm really delighted to be joining you all. Look, Ming, you opened there by saying there was this sense that we were all being directly affected, but the reality was and is that there are some people, some communities that are absolutely at the highest risk of the devastating effects, the social, the health, the economic effects of what we have been through and we are continuing to confront. And there are some examples of where governments have come together and really done very well. You know, I think we've focused on when governments have made decisions that have been grounded in good evidence, you know, focused on really the expert advice, a discipline about not being driven by politics, but, you know, that searing focus on strong outcomes. We've made some great decisions. The doubling of JobSeeker was one of them. You know, it was absolutely the right move to provide that additional support for what became from 800,000 now, as you say, about 1.7 million people, devastating effects of unemployment. It's a horrible situation for anybody to go through, but of course now we've had a rapid rise in the number of people directly affected by that. And of course, for those people, security, confidence that you're going to be able to meet the basics, you know, has fundamentally changed. Before the doubling of that job seeker payment, we had so many people telling us, you know, over 80% people saying they were skipping meals. You know, it was really the basics. This is not about the luxuries, it's the essentials of life. Nobody could live on $40 a day, and I really want to acknowledge all of those. All of you, actually, or the business community, the union movement, civil society, you know, who all said, you know, $40 a day was not enough to live on, and this was the moment. And I think also the reason that the government's moved to double job seekers, because we knew we had confidence that if you targeted support to people on lower incomes who needed it, was good policy, but also it's been really good for the economy. We know about $7 of the 10 in every $10 going into hands of people on low incomes is getting spent. It's getting spent on good things. That's what we need in the economy. You know, this is a economic challenge that is different in some ways. You know, this is the reality that we need to have confidence that people are going to be participating in the real economy, because of course, if you want to prevent long-term unemployment, one of the most important things you can do is create jobs, right? That's, I'm sure over the day and a half we've been in, that's what a big focus. And again, we shouldn't be looking to pet projects here, or, you know, things we've done in the past that we think, you know, everyone talks infrastructure, you know, oh, well, it depends whether that'll be really jobs-rich growth. So that's what we're saying. We should be focusing on job-rich growth activities, that continuing to provide that concrete support to people on low incomes, you know, a large, continuing that supplement, because we know that it is working socially and it's working economically. You know, the Reserve Bank has, you know, we need fiscal support levers here. That's what we need, and the government has done the right thing, and we urge them to continue with that. And then when it comes to an approach, you know, I mean, again, this notion of, well, we're going to allow, as the economy gets fragile, divisions can emerge. That's the last thing we need. We do need to be focusing on collective efforts together. And can I say that does mean ensuring that people and representatives most at risk, socially, economically, and health terms, should be at the top of the engagement strategies. And maybe that's something that we can talk on further today, because I think we've got work to do to make sure that the voices of people most at risk are at the top of the debates ongoing in terms of what we need around economic stimulus, approach to the economy, and of course protecting, you know, from the terrible consequences that a long-term recession could you know, unleash on communities over the long term. We want to protect people from long-term unemployment, and we know that there are particular people who are going to be particularly at risk of that, and we should be making sure that those voices and the best of that thinking is at the top of the debate, not an afterthought. Thanks.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, you know, I read back in that there was a 2015 IMF report that talked about if you grow the economic pie of actually the poorest in the country, the GDP of the country actually increases. If you actually grow the pie for the top 20% of the wealthy, most wealthy in the country, actually GDP actually goes down. So do you think there's enough of an understanding?
I don't know. Look, I think we've got to learn our lessons from the last economic downturn, the GFC, and the mistakes that we made there. We had that sort of important economic stimulus, and then we had the horror budget of 2014, which immediately started to cut away at social security, at social services supports. You know, the caring economy. You know, 1.5 billion was taken out of social services in that 2014 budget, all of which was jobs rich, and of course was all about lifting up and supporting the economy, particularly supporting the incomes of people in the bottom 40% of the community. And as you say, the best of the thinking in terms of economic approaches is to lift up the incomes and of the bottom 40% of the community, rather than a focus on the higher income groups. I'm not sure. I think we're right now having those debates I'm really hoping we've got much better consensus this time round, because we could see many of those who are the economists in these discussions know that before COVID hit, of course, the economy was not where we wanted it. It was really sluggish, and as we had argued for a number of years, part of the reason for that was that we had allowed the incomes of people to fall further and further behind. And that was, of course, impacting on the real economy and your capacity to participate in it.
Yep. Thanks, Cassandra. You know, one of the things that's also interesting that's come out as a feature of the discussion over the last couple of days is the impact on women and youth. And it's great to have somebody like Kareem on the panel, because really our young Australians remind us of the clarity of vision we had before we all got bogged down in life's realities in middle age. And, you know, one of the great things about having Kareem on the panel is he can remind us of that vision. Kareem, in your role as Australia's youth representative to the UN, you were able to meet with young Australians all over the country. Can you share with us their concerns and what their hopes are, and just remind us of their hopes for their future?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ming. And it is such a pleasure to join this discussion, and thank you to CEDA for having me as well. As you pointed out, I spent a significant portion of last year travelling across Australia and meeting with thousands of young people in over 56 communities in every state and territory, in rural, regional, remote communities, in our urban hearts as well. And I think, look, there is a mix of hope and fear. There is hope that our generation, we have so many opportunities that are available to us, made possible through technology, and that we are finding solutions to tackle some of the great issues that are impacting us and will impact us into the future. So I think there is certainly faith that we can build a more prosperous nation, but there is also a lot of fear. And I think that primarily is centered on the fact that we don't feel like we have a whole lot of control over our lives and our futures. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what our future will actually look like, particularly, uncertainty about our economic future. I mean, our generation has accumulated more debt than previous generations. Public school funding's been hamstrung. Growth in house prices is exceeding wage growth, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually enter a really competitive housing market for young people. And I think, we're experiencing higher rates of mental illness as well. And all of these issues really existed last year and continue to exist. But I think the important point is that they haven't gone away, and that they've been made significantly worse by the COVID-19 crisis. And now, with us being members of a generation that will be graduating and trying to find work into, a recession, and that will be the first generation in almost 30 years that will be doing that. That's going to, I think, reveal a whole host of new challenges as well, and exacerbate a lot of the issues that already impacted us. And we know that a lot of the industries that have already been affected by COVID-19 are dominated by young workers, many of whom are working casually in quite insecure jobs. And so the ongoing impact of a recession will be felt by us and borne by us. And the recovery, I think, will fall on our shoulders as well. So there's a whole host of issues, I think, that are really on young people's minds at the moment. But I think what really came through my consultations is that we want to have a voice in the important issues that are impacting us. We want representation in decision-making, formal decision-making structures. We want to be taken seriously. We want to feel like we are going to be a meaningful part of those discussions, and that we do have some level of control over the decisions that are being made today that will impact us now and into the future.
And do things like, we've moved from a system where they're now meeting as a national sort of cabinet. Also note that, Indigenous Australians have been asking for a voice, a greater voice in terms of how this country is run, and certainly in terms of impact on their particular community. How would you propose that younger Australians actually have that voice at the table?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different things we could consider. I published a report at the end of last year, which summarised all of the findings from my consultations and made a series of recommendations to all levels of government in Australia. And one of the recommendations we made was to establish a youth advisory council at the federal level, made up of a representative group of young people from across the community who can help advise and shape policy responses to some of the key issues that are disproportionately impacting young people. There is a model for that at the state level. A number of state and territory governments do have youth advisory councils. A lot of local councils also have similar bodies that are really effective. And when done in the right way, can actually be a really meaningful way to engage young people in these important discussions. Another thing we could do is refund the national peak body for young people. We have a series of peak bodies across Australia, again at the state and territory level. There was a peak body at the national level, but it was unfortunately defunded in 2013. And I think that would be a really important step to just making sure that we do have a formal institution at the national level that is representing young people, that is advocating for them, and that it has their best interests at heart. So there's some ideas. We had some more spicy ideas as well in the report, one of which was lowering the voting age to 16. And there are arguments, quite strong arguments that I think are in favour of making that change. But obviously that one is a little bit more controversial. So we did try and push for and focus on those first two. But plenty of ideas. Those are some that we could take.
I mean, as we all know that, really when we harness the richness of the diverse ideas we have in our country, and particularly with young Australians that are so invested in everything that us middle-aged people and older Australians are actually doing, because we're sitting in those positions of power, getting that views into those positions of power is quite important. I want to move on to Rajiv. We've been fearful. We have been so fearful of the impact of COVID on Indigenous Australians, and thankfully the Indigenous leaders have managed this pandemic with great success to date. And I don't want to debate today the Black Lives Matter protests or whether disadvantage is faced by Indigenous Australians. But Rajiv, what I want to ask you is, we've been told not to protest, and I think we all want to understand how we can actually help. From your perspective, what can we actually practically do to disrupt the disadvantage faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders?
Thanks, Ming, for your question. I'll preface my answer by saying I think it is really important that people are able to express their views and have a say and have a voice, including through peaceful protest, about what they see going on around the world and what are still really current and present issues that need to be addressed here in Australia. And I think that say can coexist with taking more practical steps. Turning to practical steps, I think there's just so much that needs to be done across so many areas. So many of the indicators still need to be addressed. I'll focus my answer on economic and business development because that's the focus of my organisation's work. And in looking at that, I think it's really important to look at it through a lens of opportunity rather than deficit. I think the opportunity for corporate Australia and for the business community, particularly coming out of COVID, is really huge. And I think that revolves mainly around partnerships, meaningful, genuine, ethical partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And coming out of the acute health phase of COVID, I think there are 3 areas of partnership that can really be explored by corporate Australia in a more meaningful way. The first is around harnessing the vast assets that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have around the country. We know, I think it's now close to 40% of Australia's landmass is held or controlled or requires participation of Indigenous Australians. And there are many groups, communities around the country that want to unlock the economic potential of that land, but they want to do it in an ethical and a sustainable way. And to do that, they need genuine collaboration, engagement, investment, and building of relationships with corporate Australia. Also in doing that, I think it's time to reimagine what's possible in terms of industries. We can look beyond mining, agribusiness, and to new economies. And we're seeing examples of that start to happen and continue even through COVID. One example, in my organisation, we financed the construction of a satellite ground station in Central Australia on Indigenous held land, and that will be leased out to a global communications company. So that creates an income stream back for the community, but we had Aboriginal businesses involved in the construction of the facility and who will be involved in the ongoing maintenance and management of that facility. And that ultimately equates real jobs on the ground. I think the second area of partnerships is around truly valuing and recognising Indigenous knowledge. Before COVID, we of course had the catastrophic bushfires, and there was a conversation that was gaining momentum about Indigenous knowledge in fire and land management and how that could be better valued and recognised and engaged with by corporate Australia. I think that conversation is still flowing in the background, but those opportunities need to be looked at as well. And then the third area, I think, is in social procurement and supply chains. We know the Indigenous business sector has grown really significantly over the past decade. And a lot of that has been through the resilience and ingenuity of Indigenous business people themselves, but also has been supported by government policy like the Indigenous procurement policy at a federal level. We want to make sure those gains aren't lost and we can continue that momentum as we come out of COVID. And I think that requires a different model from corporate Australia. It requires engaging with businesses early and seeing it not as a transaction, but as a relationship, so that there's visibility of what's coming through the pipeline. That might be through the infrastructure spend that's been flagged or through many other areas. And we know that Indigenous businesses are 100 times more likely to employ Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So in terms of what Cassandra was talking about, that equates to jobs. So I think those are some areas we can look at.
Yeah, Rajiv, it sounded like, sorry, in one of your stories that we built another dish. The movie just reminded me of the movie The Dish, and another on Indigenous land. So hopefully there's a sheep station around it. But do you think this time around, because I can imagine some of these initiatives you've had for quite some time, right? And you've talked about the fact that, you know, we've made inroads, but really we're not making probably inroads as fast as we would like, or certainly the Indigenous people communities would like. Do you think this time around with the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter sort of movement as well, that there is really a change in the mindset of the business community, but also more broadly within society itself, that to understand the disadvantage that's been faced by Indigenous Australians over multiple generations?
Yes, I think we've been seeing that shift happen for some time. And I think in corporate Australia, organisations like Reconciliation Australia have been doing a fantastic job in driving that and also taking a stand on issues when that's needed. So I see a lot of goodwill and willingness to engage from corporate Australia, but it's about how that occurs, and it's about really listening and making sure that the initiatives that get off the ground are Indigenous led. We, as non-Indigenous Australians, don't have the answers. We need to listen and learn and really be willing to change our models of doing business if we're going to achieve real results.
Yeah. Now, all three of you bring pretty unique perspectives from your backgrounds, and really I also see that you don't sit in isolation. And there was a recognition yesterday of the and we talked about it today as well in previous sessions about the disproportionate impact of women and of impact of COVID on women and young Australians. Plus, we see the stark impact of on Indigenous Australians over multiple generations. What is the impact of intersection of all of these issues, of intersection of at-risk people and communities, and how do we make sure that these people also have the opportunity to capture the work through all of the government initiatives and spending through infrastructure that they've got right now? Can I start with you, Rajiv?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think with any at-risk community, there's multiple dimensions of disadvantage. No community is homogenous, and certainly the Indigenous communities across Australia are very diverse. There are some shared experiences, but there's many layers of disadvantage and complexity and difference depending on geographic location and a host of other factors. We talk a lot today about young people. We know that the Indigenous population in Australia is the youngest. Over 50% of the population, I think, at the last census was under the age of 25. So the issues that affect young people are particularly prevalent in these communities. I think it's about, as was said by Kareem earlier, really listening and being willing to accept the views of the people that are most affected and putting them at the top of the conversation, as Cassandra mentioned. When it comes to young people, we've tried to do that in our organisation by creating networks. We call it Futures Forum. So we've got young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are in business or getting into business from around the country, including regional and remote areas, coming together to talk about what does the future of business and economic development look like for them and in their communities, and what does that mean for government and corporate Australia in terms of what we offer and how we work with them. Hopefully that goes some way to answering your question.
Yes. Yeah. Kareem, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Rajiv. Young people are incredibly complex and diverse, and whilst we do have a lot of things that are common between us, there is a lot of nuance there. So taking, I think, a one-size-fits-all approach would be deeply problematic in addressing any policy issue, but particularly a policy issue that impacts young people. So I think what we really need to do is look at a broader context and have a more sophisticated analysis of COVID-19 that moves beyond just thinking about any one group or any one factor, and takes into account multiple inequalities and disadvantages that people will be facing. I think we need to, in some cases, work with communities and work with young people to better understand what specific challenges they face. Again, bringing them into decision-making structures to help to formulate policy responses. And I think, people's individual and group experiences it's important that they're placed into broader contexts as well. And I think governments need to also think about broadening the bailout and stimulus packages that they've been providing to prioritise those who are most at risk. So using that data that they're collecting to identify those most at risk and then tailoring their response to those people, because what may work for a particular community may not be as effective in another community. And the only way you're going to ascertain that is to genuinely listen to those people who you're seeking to serve, as Rajiv pointed out.
Yeah, Cassandra, the interesting thing, I suppose, for you as well is that, we've got the 1.6 million people that's sitting on Job Seeker. We've got people that have never received any government support of that nature before, potentially on JobKeeper. There's 3 million of them. You now have many more people that understand what you've been advocating for. Do you think that then really does change the conversation for you, taking into account that, we're also now seeing the impact on youth and also Indigenous Australians? Does that really broaden the discussion you've got and make it a little bit more powerful to people in Canberra?
Well, it should, Ming, and I think if we get the decision-making structures and the power structures fixed, then this could be a really important, exciting moment for us to take a different direction in this country. I think it's important for us to name the fact that mostly still the most powerful decision-making structures are dominated by older white men. That's the fact of it. Everybody can see that. It's a call for those, decision makers to say, we're gonna open this up. We're going to invite in the young people, Kareem. We're going to actually give you a seat at the table. We're going to give the, Asian background women of Australia a place at the table, Ming, around those tables. It's very important that we call this out. And of course, the advocacy for the voice for First Nations people, this is not something to just think about later. Like, if there was ever a time to go, this is the time, Rajiv, to get that done. Now is the right time for us to do that. And then so they're the big structures. And then I think there is something really important that we've demonstrated again about the power of local community collaboration. You know, people have tasted that. I think through the COVID period, there was this reaching out door to door, you know, small communities coming together saying because actually we had to make sure we got it right. And there's some in the power of that collaboration at the local regional level which enables that diversity of experience to be heard personally. And there's a lot of power in that. And so part of what we're advocating as well as fixing up the big sort of, you know, political structures to be investing at the regional local level, bringing together local employers, local civil society groups, local politicians, that much more grassroots bottom-up approach. There's a power in that. We're a huge country. I mean, you know, our First Nations peoples know that better than anybody. This is many countries in one. And we need very localised approaches. And I think many of the business communities have a real opportunity there. We want to drive local economies. You know, when we're talking about the fiscal stimulus and the economic stimulus, the sorts of proposals we've been pushing are those that are actually small scale, can be built locally. So social housing, you know, all over the country, fabulous. Energy efficiency, retrofitting of local homes to save people, you know, energy bills. Again, great local jobs, and there could be wonderful opportunities for First Nations businesses to get involved, for pathways for people most at risk of, you know, long-term unemployment to be getting that local training, you know, with local employers in this kind of next stage of driving jobs-rich growth. That's what we all want, but it's got to be in a way that gives priority to people who are most vulnerable to long-term unemployment. And if we don't do that now, we will see people 10 years down the track who will never get back into the labour market, and there will be young people, as you know, Kareem, you talk about that fear, who they're worried if they don't land a job in the next 6 months, you know, they start to think, will I ever get stable, ongoing economic opportunity? And all of us should be determined to fix that. And as I say, some of that needs to be locally driven, and the other part of it is to really lift up and empower the voices of those most at risk. And I reckon every time we've done it, we've got it right. The HIV virus was one of those, you know, stories to be told again, and that's where there was this really strong partnership with the communities most at risk, who drove the strategy. And when, you know, First Nations communities, when this virus first hit, just said, we're going to do it. Exactly the power of, you know, controlling the decision making led to those really great outcomes. And I think we're capable of that, but we're going to need some people to think about, can I let other people in to the discussions that I have the privilege of being involved in terms of decision making structures?
Yep. We have a number of questions through Pigeonhole, so thank you for people for sending it in. One a very interesting question, you know, if I wear my black hat, the community sector was already facing funding and capacity issues before COVID, right? There was a struggle to get New Start increased, all that sort of stuff. How can we convince governments now when, you know, we heard yesterday the Prime Minister talk about his concern around debt levels. We've heard Kareem talk about concern around debt levels that the next generation are inheriting. How can we convince governments now to actually increase investment in these preventative areas so that we can actually save people and lives? Because really, I think the stories we've heard of people now who've moved from New Start to Job Seeker, you know, there was an increased amount. They're able to actually buy food and pay off necessary sort of bills. How do we, you know, get the government to maintain at least Job Seeker where it is, but also to maintain that investment with this concern about ongoing debt? Can I start with you, Kareem? I know, Cassandra, you'll have a lot to say on this, so I just want to start with Kareem.
Sure. Well, I think the important point is that before Job Seeker was introduced, there were a significant portion of young people who are on New Start and effectively living below the poverty line. So really, the job seeker scheme and job keeper scheme have really brought us up to the level that we should have been prior to this pandemic. And yes, we're getting more support, but many of us are still really struggling. So I mean, the current climate has changed radically as we come out of this crisis. I think we're going to need to rethink a lot of the government supports that are in place, and social security that's in place, and the welfare system as we know it. A lot of young people, as you pointed out, Cassandra, are going to be in a really insecure position. We already are working in really insecure employment. Our futures are in doubt, particularly now that we're in a recession. An unprecedented, I think it was 170,000 plus people aged between 21 and 25 applied to access the superannuation early this year. And that's something we've never seen before. So I think we need to have serious discussion about what sort of supports young people are going to need now coming out of this crisis. And I think it's really important, again, not to labour this point too much, that young people are a part of that discussion, that post-COVID recovery talks do involve young people, that there is a youth strategy and youth-focused recovery effort, and that there are tailored policies aimed at getting meaningful employment opportunities to young people.
Yep.
I think that is absolutely crucial.
Yeah. Cassandra?
Ming, what's wonderful about the facts, the evidence on the case for increasing job seeker, is that it hits every element of what you'd want in a recovery. As I said, it's targeted. The cash into the hands through the transfer payment system goes very quickly out into the real economy, and that's exactly what we need right now. We also know that if you are worried about unemployment, and the government, all governments will be focused on the unemployment rate and jobs, getting people back into jobs, supporting that, you don't cut job seeker. In fact, exactly, you don't do that. That is not what you do. And at the moment, the reality is if we look after jobs through economic growth, the debt will look after itself. That's the reality of how it will work. And we're in a very low, rate environment. And if we all get on, a determined track of investing in the right kind of job creation activity, and of course, the caring economy is really jobs rich. All those female-dominated jobs, healthcare, social services, again, don't make the mistake that we made just about 10 years ago of cutting away in those kinds of parts of the economy. That's where all the jobs are. That's the kind of, again, we will be creating jobs and very rapidly, and we'll be looking after each other. And, I think people got a really great taste of that's a very high motivator for us. And that sense that we can all see very quickly the benefits of this kind of investment. I think we need to get away from this notion that, providing supports to focus on people at a point where you need help is an act of charity. It's not. It's the right thing to do socially, and it's the right thing to do economically. And if we did some of the other things around fixing the environment, I think we'd all be pretty proud of us as a country, and we got a taste of what that feels like when you do things well.
Yeah, and that's certainly obviously for young Australians a particular concern, that if you have a look at Kareem's report, that's there too. I have another question, and I just want to craft it slightly differently. There's a lot of, I think, community concern and outrage at the moment that's connected to what we saw around the death of George Floyd, but there's an immediacy to that which we almost need to help continue and endure beyond this particular moment. Rajiv, how do we actually support, the Indigenous communities much longer beyond this immediacy of response for Black Lives Matter, so that they're no longer at risk the next time we have a pandemic or another crisis? And I suspect this is a very long-term, enduring project that we need to be working on for multiple generations.
Yeah, and in answering this, I mean, I don't speak for communities, so I'll speak for myself. I think it starts with all of us taking a level of individual responsibility and accountability for not being silent and not letting the conversations fade away into the background. That's very much where it starts. It's about educating ourselves about the reality of the issues that many people are facing in Australia, particularly in Indigenous communities, and then about being courageous and being bold and being willing to have those conversations in our workplaces and in our social circles. So for me, it starts very much organically with that, and those of us who work in the sector or in related sectors, we can show leadership, be role models, and make sure those conversations stay on the agenda and that we support the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have to lead that conversation.
Yep. Okay, look, we don't have a lot of time left. I do want to go through the poll results that's in front of me. The question in the poll, please go in and put in your thoughts if you haven't already. The question was, the safety net deployed during the crisis has been unprecedented. Compared to the current level of support for vulnerable and at-risk communities, government support beyond the crisis should be less, more, or the same. People who responded less was 4.6%. The same was 32.6%, and more was 62.8%. So if I can say the three of you have done your job this morning, because the poll results would certainly back up what you're all actually asking for. And I really appreciate, I think, the insights that the three of you have actually brought to the conversation today as well. So the opportunity for me, and just in wrap up, the opportunity exists really for our country to strengthen our economy by providing opportunity to those who've been most severely impacted. And doing this, I believe, will accelerate the recovery for our society and our country more broadly so that we can come back better. Really, our indifference will imperil our resilience. The next session is going to commence at 2:15. It's the closing session and wrap up of today's discussions, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.